Hello and welcome to vChat number 52. My name is David Davis from VMware Videos and Actual Tech Media. I'm excited to be joined by...
And I'm Simon Seagrave from techhead.co.
And our special guest, very special guest, I should add, is Mr. Scott Lowe today. Thank you for being on, Scott.
Hey, thanks. It's my pleasure. It's good to be here and good to catch up with you guys.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's great to see you as always there, Scott. It's been a while.
It has indeed. So thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah, thanks for being on. So I follow you on Twitter. I retweet a lot of your good content on Kubernetes and cloud native and Heptio. But I bet a lot of our audience might not know about your relatively recent changes. Why don't you tell us about what's been going on in the life of Scott Lowe?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So, I was very active in the VMware community for many years. I look back on it now, probably about 15 years, all said and done, when I first started getting into VMware and working with it in my role as an engineer, an SE with the reseller on the East Coast, excuse me, and then progressing on to work at EMC, where I met Simon, and although I may have met you before then, but in any case, we worked together there, and then onto VMware again. Or onto VMware, because I never actually worked for VMware till the very end when I joined to work on NSX. And over the course of that, as things happen, right? You grow and you evolve in your career. And I really enjoyed what I was doing in the VMware space, but I felt like I needed to challenge myself. And I don't want to derail the conversation, but at some point, if the opportunity presents itself, there's a really good conversation to be had about technical individuals like us. As we get a little older, right? I'm late 40s now. I just had a birthday, and sort of the evolution of that individual. Like, do you stay technical? Do you move into management? That sort of thing, right? And for me, I wasn't ready to give up the technical side of it yet. I had plenty of opportunities to go into management. I wasn't ready to give up the technical side of it. I looked back at my career and I said, where did I find the greatest satisfaction? And that was when I was really digging into a technology and helping other people understand that technology in the early days of VMware's adoption, right? Sort of where my blog, really got a lot of attention. And before we published Mastering vSphere 4 and 5 and 5.5 and blah, blah, blah. And so as I began looking for, what was the right thing for me in terms of my career and what I was looking for, I started looking out at some startups focused in the container and Kubernetes space, because I felt like that was an area that was really going to have an impact on the industry. And I got connected with Heptio. Heptio is the company that was founded by Joe Beda and Craig McLuckie, who were two of the people who helped create Kubernetes while they were at Google. And they have assembled a really great team of individuals focused on Kubernetes and focused on helping enterprises adopt Kubernetes. And it was just the right opportunity for me. And so in my role, I'm able to focus almost exclusively on helping customers actually get Kubernetes up and running in their environment. So it's, a lot of rubber meets the road, right? In the trenches doing the work, not just talking about it, which is, I found extremely satisfying. So yeah, I've been at Heptio now for, what is this, October? 6 months.
Wow.
Yeah.
Flown by. Yeah, definitely. And just Scott, have you found the transition coming from a predominantly VMware background across to Heptio and obviously Kubernetes? How's that transition been? Has it been, has your knowledge and experience with VMware sort of set you up for dipping your toes, or not more than dipping your toes, jumping straight into the Kubernetes environment? Any similarities there, or was it learning from scratch again?
Well, there's a lot of similarities in the technology, and we can dig into that. Sort of like make a compare and contrast for folks who are managing vSphere environments today to kind of help them understand, like, what is this thing and how does this relate to what I'm doing, today, right? But as far as like for me, I had already started like focusing on a lot of non-VMware products and projects before I left the company. So if you can sort of follow things along my site, right? You see what I'm writing about. You start looking in 2012. I started writing a lot about Open vSwitch and Linux networking and OpenFlow and all that, which kind of led right into joining Nicira / the NSBU at VMware in early 2013, and then continuing on. But I was focused on OpenStack, and I was focused on Open vSwitch and sort of the non-ESXi environments, right? And then in 2013, later in 2013, early 2014, you started seeing me talking about containers and Docker and Docker networking, that sort of thing, as I was at that time, when I was working for NSBU, helping them formulate the strategy that you now see coming to fruition with the Kubernetes support in NSXT. But you're never really fully prepared to be in the trenches with the technology until you actually do it, right? Like, I'm sure you guys, and especially you, David, like, you've done tons and tons of training videos, right? But there's still something about actually doing the work that exposes something about the technology that you just don't have time to cover in a training course, right? So no matter how much time I had spent up front with Kubernetes, and I had spent a pretty fair amount of time working with it, and how much time you spend up front working with related technologies, it's not until you get into the meat of it that you really realize, wow, there's a lot more here that I didn't account for and so it's been a pretty aggressive ramp up period for me over the last 6 months. I'm thankful to the team at Heptio for giving me that opportunity to sort of respool my skill set, but it's been a lot of fun, and I'm really, really finding a lot of job satisfaction in digging into the technology and learning a lot, and then turning around and giving that knowledge back to the broader community, which I think encompasses the VMware community, because they're going to have to begin to sort of start including Kubernetes in their designs and architectures as time progresses.
Yeah, got you. And I think this is probably a good point in the conversation there, Scott. I mean, for those listeners out there who are perhaps not familiar with Kubernetes as to what it is, and I definitely bundle myself into that category there. I know enough to be dangerous, but definitely not a mid to deep level at all. Could you just walk us through what is Kubernetes?
Yeah, sure, of course. So to understand what Kubernetes does, you have to kind of take a step back first and think about, kind of what containers are, right? And the problem space or the thing that containers are trying to solve. So if you're, all of us, we have strong backgrounds in VMware vSphere, right? We're accustomed to, and I have this new phrase, this new way of explaining it. I'm gonna try it out with you guys. We're accustomed to creating what I like to call infrastructure artifacts, right? If you look at what a vSphere admin creates, it is predominantly a reflection of infrastructure. It is a virtual machine. It is a virtual network. It is a virtual disk, something of that nature, right? And these are all automation artifacts. These are all infrastructure artifacts. These are all artifacts of, or bundles or snippets of infrastructure, right? And when you get into containers, you're moving away from infrastructure artifacts and you're creating application artifacts. A Docker container, or not necessarily Docker, we could be talking about other runtimes as well, but a Linux container, and in the future Windows containers, they are really about the application. They're about bundling the application code and the application dependencies into a unit that you can then deploy somewhere on infrastructure, right? So these two things are really, if you look at like where VMware is with vSphere, right? It's infrastructure, and where Kubernetes is with containers, it's applications. They really aren't necessarily competitive, okay? The types of things that you're creating are different, right? As a network engineer, you might be creating what I would call, infrastructure artifacts, right? You're creating networking configurations and VLANs. As a storage administrator, you're creating infrastructure artifacts, LUNs and disk groups and so on and so forth. As a vSphere admin, you're creating infrastructure artifacts. But as soon as you move into the Kubernetes space and start using containers, you're creating application artifacts. Now, based on that sort of fundamental shift in terms of what you're trying to accomplish and what you're actually doing, the whole idea behind Kubernetes is to provide, and I'll try to avoid some of the marketing-y definitions, right? But there are some important words that you have to think about, right? We often see the term, it provides a declarative environment for deploying applications, and you might think, oh, that's just a marketing term. But if you dig deeper, the idea here is that you're telling Kubernetes how you want the environment to look, not what you want it to do, right?
So
great example.
Like policy-based management in vSphere? You define a policy around, say, a VM, and you say, I want this VM to have these characteristics or whatever. Yeah,
you could think of it that way. Absolutely. Yeah, that's a reasonable comparison. I'll make a comparison using kids, right? Because we all have kids, right? So, and if you don't, somebody who does, and you understand this, right? So when kids are little, you're basically working with them in what I would call an imperative mode. Go pick up your toys, go make your bed, go put away your clothes, go eat your Brussels sprouts, whatever, right? You're telling them what to do, not how you want it. As they get older, you say, I want your room to be clean. You're describing the state of what they want their room to be, not how they go about doing it, right?
Right.
And that's a declarative model. And so what we look at in Kubernetes is this is a declarative model. You say, I want 3 copies of this application code running. I want this application code to be available outside the cluster. I want you to automatically restart in the event of a failure, et cetera, right? You're using, describing the state of what you want it to be rather than how or what it should do. And then it handles it according to the way that it's been built, right? And so Kubernetes is this declarative platform for deploying these application artifacts, right, onto infrastructure and providing a set of building blocks that allow you to deploy that application and then run it and have customers, clients, other applications connect to it and do something with it, right? So it's not just about getting code running, but also how do I access that code? How do I ensure that the code is running in multiple places? And if something fails, how do I ensure that something restarts, et cetera, et cetera? So all of these concepts that are built into the Kubernetes platform are built around making applications available as part of a deployment.
So around that, Scott, so people listening to this might, obviously with regard to applications, especially all the infrastructure administrators out there. So the types of applications you'd be running on a Kubernetes platform there, or environment rather, are we talking next generation applications, or are we talking legacy, or a combination of both? For example, could we pick up an old finance system that's been running on a server for the last 15 years? It's, everyone's too scared to touch. I mean, is that the type of thing that we could sort of lift and shift into Kubernetes, or are we talking sort of next gen apps that have been coded from the ground up?
Well, so the reality is that these environments are going to work best with applications that have been designed to work in these environments, right? So yes, you can take applications that were written ages ago and containerize them and run them on Kubernetes, right? So I'm working with a customer right now, and I won't share any details about the customer, but they have applications which are, considered legacy applications that they're leveraging as part of a project. And these legacy applications have certain expectations. They expect to have a consistent host name when they start up. They expect to start up in a particular order. They expect to have persistent storage so that if they restart, that storage is still there. It hasn't gone away. And these are sort of all hallmarks, if you will, of sort of a classic legacy enterprise piece of software, right? And yet we're deploying them successfully and running them successfully on Kubernetes. So the functionality is there. Are there going to be some caveats, some gotchas? Yeah, of course, right? The devil is always in the details. I mean, anybody who says, vSphere is the right solution for everything, well, there are always edge cases where it may not be the best use case, right? I mean, it's just the way it is. And it's not a negative reflection on the technology. It's just the reality of the world in which we live, right? Same goes to saying public cloud is the answer to everything. Not necessarily.
Exactly. There's never a one size fits all. It's on a case by case. Definitely.
That's exactly right. And so, yes, customers can take their legacy Java apps and bring them into Kubernetes. Yes, they can take legacy applications and bring them into Kubernetes. Might there be some caveats, some gotchas, some things we have to work around? Of course. We can also take those new applications that were built from the ground up to be stateless or to store state somewhere else, because honestly, nothing's really ever stateless. It's just turtles all the way down, if you will. And deploy them, and they may scale out better and they may behave, sort of better, if you will, in the Kubernetes environment. But there's options for both. So I know that's a long-winded way of saying it depends, right? but there are ways to do just about any kind of application on Kubernetes to run.
No, fantastic. No, that's a really good answer, Scott, because that definitely answers it. So it is definitely not an either or. It's you can run both on the platform there.
Sure. Absolutely.
So Scott, I mean, I know Docker has a series of training videos out on YouTube called Modernizing Traditional Applications, where they step people through, virtual or containerizing like Exchange and SQL. I'm curious, I mean, just because you can do that doesn't mean that you should do that. I'm curious, when you go out and talk to real companies out there, are they doing things like that or not? What's your take on that?
Yeah, so I haven't run into any customers that are like containerizing SQL Server, Microsoft SQL Server or Microsoft Exchange. And I agree with you, David, like just because you can doesn't mean you should, right? What we do see a lot of are customers who are writing their own software. So they are a software development shop in some form or fashion. They may be writing software that they use internally, right? That gives them a competitive edge in whatever market they're in. They may be writing software that they're offering as a service. So they're a SaaS provider for some sort of, audience or application. Or they may be, actual ISV type company and they write software and then sell it to other people. But predominantly what we see in customers is when they're developing their own software is they're porting over those applications or those application components that they're using in order to run them on Kubernetes, right? So it wouldn't be your typical sort of commercial off-the-shelf type stuff. Although you can do that, it's typically more custom stuff that they're writing, a custom Java app or a Python Flask app or, some Node.js or, something of that nature that they wrote that is some supporting feature or maybe a glue code that, ties two services together, something like that. So does that help?
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah.
So, I mean, a lot of our audience, like Simon said, are the traditional VMware vSphere admin. I mean, what's your advice to them when it comes to, cloud native apps and Kubernetes? Is that something you feel like vSphere admins really need to learn?
That's a difficult question to answer. I'll just be honest, right?
Yeah.
Partially because I recognize my own bias, and partially because there are so many variables in there that it's impossible to give an answer of like, yes, everyone should. Now, let me unpack that just a little bit, right? I have a natural bias, and I freely admit this and recognize I have a natural bias towards growth, right? You can see that in my career. You can see that in how I tackle technologies, how I tackle my own personal and professional development. I'm always saying, what can I do next, right? What's the next thing I can learn? What's the next thing I can tackle? What's the next thing I can understand? That's just my nature. There are a lot of folks out there who aren't like that, and that's okay, right? I mean, that's okay. I believe some measure of that is necessary because IT as an industry doesn't stop. So there's always going to be change, and you have to be accustomed to that. But that being said, there are plenty of positions and roles out there where you can come in with a particular skill set and do that job very, very well and serve your company very, very well, and not be in a constant state of growth or change, right? So there's that, right? There's also just, if you work for a company that is, largely static, right? I don't want to use the term stagnant because that has negative connotations, but an environment that's very static and there isn't a great competitive edge to be had in writing your own software and all of what you use is commercial off-the-shelf stuff, there may not be a tremendous amount of value just yet. Now, I believe that we're going to see a shift in ISVs delivering software via containers, just as much in the same way we saw ISVs start to deliver software in virtual appliances, right? And so I think that will be another form factor that ISVs will offer. So you'll be able to say, oh, I want to download a virtual appliance, or I am going to, just take a set of containers that you're going to deploy, and they're going to give you the manifests, and you're going to apply that against your Kubernetes cluster, and off you are to the races, right? And in that future, it becomes something that you should know about. But is it something everyone should learn? I don't know. I think there's probably populations out there that aren't going to need it and may never benefit from it. I mean, I have to be honest there.
And I was thinking of that piece of career advice you gave me actually some time back. Always be thinking about what you're going to do next in your career. And that doesn't devalue what you're doing right now, but
Correct.
Always be prepared for the future. And I think that's really good advice, and it still sticks with me. And I appreciate, the honest answer about Kubernetes, because I think like what you said, is very true. I mean, I remember back when, they just started delivering applications as VMs, and that was, kind of cutting edge. And now just about every Microsoft application is available, in a container for download. And a lot of Microsoft, Windows admins might not even know or care about that yet. But I think you're right. It seems like it's in the future out there. So if somebody was interested in learning Kubernetes, I mean, what advice do you have, any or resources? I mean, how did you go about it?
Well, the topic of learning something new is something that I tackle a lot on my podcast, right? The Full Stack Journey podcast. And consistently, one of the messages that I hear from guests when we talk about this sort of thing is you always have to attach it to a problem, something to be solved, right? Like trying to learn some new piece of software or technology in a vacuum doesn't work, right? So if you're going to say, hey, I need to learn Kubernetes and I want to become more familiar with this, you need to understand, how does that help solve a business problem in your current role, right? And then you can begin to tackle that and say, okay, my development team at my company is having problems getting their code into production, and we have disconnects between development environments and production environments. These are the sorts of things, among others, that Kubernetes could help address through the use of containers and container orchestration. So I'm going to see how I could go about tackling this, right? And then you begin to unravel the pieces that are there. That being said, there are a number of resources. The Linux Academy has a great introductory course. There's all kinds of tutorials and stuff online. I will give a special shout out and a warning about Kubernetes the Hard Way by Kelsey Hightower, okay? And as soon as you get into the Kubernetes space, somebody's going to tell you about Kubernetes the hard way. And Kelsey is just an extraordinarily talented and intelligent celebrity within the Kubernetes community. But it's important to understand this Kubernetes the hard way thing is it's a process optimized for learning, and it's not a production grade setup, okay? So, you go out and you see how he does this, and you will learn a lot about the inner workings of Kubernetes when you walk through this process that he's established, right? But that's not the production way to turn up a Kubernetes cluster. It just isn't, right? And so, use that as a learning tool, but recognize that it is what it is. It's just a learning tool, right? But the Kubernetes documentation itself is good and getting better. And a lot of the tutorials that they've added in the last couple of releases, in the 1.11 and 1.12 just got released, have added more content and more detail. And so there's a pretty reliably now you can walk through this step-by-step procedure off the Kubernetes website, right? And get a highly available multi-node control plane powered Kubernetes cluster up and running.
So a question for you around that, Scott. I mean, many of the listeners here or viewers would have their own home labs still, either physical labs at the home, or maybe they've migrated out to the cloud now. But how quickly would you estimate, someone who wants to learn Kubernetes? I mean, how fast can you get Kubernetes up and running in a lab environment, for example?
So that's a good question, and it really depends on what you're trying to accomplish, right? And I apologize, I hate to use it depends, but it does. So one of the tools that as a company Heptio has been investing in is this tool called kubeadm. It ships with the Kubernetes distribution, right? So when Kubernetes releases a new version, the new version of kubeadm is always released as well, because it's part of the overall project, right? And you can use that literally with one command to stand up a Kubernetes control plane node, and then with another command, join a worker node to it. So you could have a single node Kubernetes control plane, so that's not highly available, right? But it's functional. And multiple worker nodes running in your home lab, vSphere powered, or running at AWS or GCP or Azure, probably in less than 10 minutes.
Wow.
Maybe less than that, to be honest, right? Now, it doesn't have all the bells and whistles, and like I said, it's not highly available and all this, right? But it is a fully functional and fully conformant Kubernetes cluster. And I point that out just meaning that it will pass all the conformance tests that the Kubernetes community places on a cluster in order to be called Kubernetes, right? So kubeadm is basically the community's way of embedding best practices in code, right? So it sets up a cluster according to the community's best practices.
Okay.
Really, really powerful tool, and I think underrated in many respects. But to your points, I mean, if you're out there and you're running your home lab and you've got, something ridiculous like Mark Brookfield, or you've got a few, nooks underneath your desk, you could have a Kubernetes cluster up and running in just a few minutes.
Wow, that's fantastic. And then Scott, obviously, working for Heptio now, and you mentioned Heptio there. I mean, how does Heptio fit into the Kubernetes space? I mean, what are the sort of products and services that Heptio offers? You mentioned one there, for example.
Yeah, sure. So we are, we're startup, right? A little less than 2 years in existence right now. And a lot of our work thus far has been investing in a number of open source projects that we feel are important and that we created based on feedback that we were getting from customers. So as customers were adopting Kubernetes and they were saying, hey, we have this pain point around X, then we were like, okay, is there something we can solve here? Do we solve it in the Kubernetes community itself, right? And I would throw our investments in KubeADM, which is a community project. It's not a Heptio project, it's a community project, to be that sort of example. What can we solve within the broader Kubernetes community itself, right, by working upstream? Or is this something that we should launch as a separate open source project because it doesn't need to be tied to Kubernetes, right? And so we have a number of open source projects in that regard. We have one called Sonobuoy, which is the conformance test that the Kubernetes community uses. So when you spin up a Kubernetes cluster and you want to verify that that cluster is operating as expected, you would run a Sonobuoy scan against it. We have an open source tool called Arc, which is a backup and restore tool. It's, as far as I'm aware, the only backup and restore tool available for Kubernetes. That's that you back up a cluster back up the state of a cluster in one place and restore the state of that cluster in another place, right? So very, very powerful tool. And seeing a lot of interest in that tool, by the way, from storage vendors who are writing integrations, plugins into Arc to enable them to do snapshots of persistent volumes or to back up the Kubernetes cluster state onto their platform, right? We have what's the specific Kubernetes term is called an ingress controller. It's a way of managing HTTP, HTTPS traffic coming into a cluster. We have one built on the Envoy open source proxy that Lyft released. That's called Contour. And then we recently, most recently, introduced one called Gimbal, which is actually a multi-cluster routing tool. So it actually lets you route traffic among multiple Kubernetes clusters or Kubernetes clusters and OpenStack. So we actually have a customer who is routing traffic between components of an application running on Kubernetes and components of an application running on their legacy OpenStack cloud.
Wow, that's impressive. Definitely have a number of products and projects going on at the moment.
Now, in addition to that, we have a bunch of stuff that we're doing that we haven't announced yet. And since I do enjoy my job, I can't talk about those other than just to say like there's more to come, right? But what we are doing is committing to work faithfully in the open source upstream community, be good stewards of the open source community, and then build open source projects that help solve real problems. And I won't get into the whole company values thing and how those reflect our company values, but they do.
And Scott, that's cool. What I read about Heptio is that they offer an undistribution of Kubernetes. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, that term I think is something that our marketing department wants to strike from history. But I guess the key thing around that is we believe that ultimately for Kubernetes to be successful, you need to be running upstream Kubernetes, right? And rather than sort of forking Kubernetes and creating our own distribution of it, which is not built from necessarily directly from upstream code, right? But has some, added special sauce, right? And therefore lags behind the upstream community by some period of time, where we have to kind of rewrite that special sauce in order to address the things. We want to focus on actually making upstream consumable directly by customers. Like that's where the greatest value is, right? The value for us is not in writing some proprietary code that makes Kubernetes a little bit better, because that doesn't incent the Kubernetes community to improve. That actually allows the Kubernetes community to stagnate and not solve the problems because somebody else is solving them in some other piece of code that the broader community isn't able to take advantage of. We'd rather invest upstream and make it better for the entire community and better for ourselves so that everyone can take advantage of upstream, and then we'll get our value from other places, which would be those other things that we can't talk about yet. So we initially sort of, and I say we as in the company, this was before my time, came up with that term undistribution because we were like, we're not your we're not just another Kubernetes distribution, right? We're not taking the code and forking it and having a lag between, Kubernetes upstream releasing 112 and then 6 months before we release our version of 112, that sort of thing, right? Instead, we wanted to say, we want you to go directly to upstream, and we're going to put our efforts in making that consumable and usable by customers. So
right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, that does make sense. And I mean, as I understand it, that forking and creating new distributions problem, I mean, that happens a lot, like in the OpenStack community and with Linux distributions and stuff, where it's like, hey, I started a new company. It's David Davis's Linux distribution. Come check it out. And it just doesn't make sense, and it creates a lot of confusion. So I think that's smart.
The Linux, a lot of people will make the comparison to Linux, and I think that's probably not a fair comparison because Linux is extraordinarily mature, right? I mean, 25 years, right?
Yeah.
The Linux has been around. So that's a there's been plenty of time for that model to stabilize, right? With a lot of these other open source projects, what we find is that distributions end up stalling the growth of the project because these commercial entities end up taking their own vested interest in their fork rather than contributing that stuff back upstream.
Okay. So, I mean, you spent a lot of time in the VMware community. I'm curious, how does the open source cloud native community compare?
I don't know that I'm qualified to answer that question yet. Okay. and here's why, right? As an individual, I am allergic to folks who suddenly appear in a community and declare themselves to be, thought leaders or, thought facilitators or whatever term you want to, throw there, right? And so I feel like coming into the Kubernetes community, I have to spend some time sort of earning my stripes, if you will, right?
Yeah.
There's a phrase that we use in the Kubernetes community, and I believe, and I hope I'm not misattributing it, I believe it's attributed to Sarah Novotny, but we call it, chopping wood and carrying water, meaning doing the needful things that need to be done, not the glamorous things, right? And so I felt like as I came into the Kubernetes community, I needed to spend some time doing the necessary things that need to be done, right? Working with customers, doing actual deployments, going through the learning process myself, contributing back where I'm able to do so, whether that just be opening issues and documentation or actually writing documentation to contribute back or whatever the case may be. And so I don't have as good a feel for the open source Kubernetes cloud native community yet. My initial assessment is that it's a very vibrant community, much like the VMware community, right? And very diverse, very inclusive, but also very vibrant in terms of like growth and challenging yourself, right? Which I think align well largely with some of my professional goals. So I don't know if that's an actual answer, but it's the best I can give at this point.
I think it's a very honest answer, and I appreciate that.
Of course.
So last night, I think it was, I saw you tweeting about a cloud native meetup. What was that like?
That was pretty good. Actually, it was the inaugural event for a Kubernetes and cloud native meetup that's being started in Boulder. Now, the quick geography lesson, Boulder isn't exactly close to my house. It's almost an hour and a half away. But I wanted to go just to kind of get a feel for it. I'd like to try and start something closer to my area and help kind of get that going. So I wanted to kind of go and see what they were talking about and how they organized it, and try and learn some things there from the organizers. But it was the first inaugural meeting for this particular group, and they had a couple of people in presenting on a couple of different topics. And I thought it went well. I appreciated the opportunity to attend. So
cool.
Yeah.
Well, it's been a great discussion. I've learned a lot. Simon, are you all up to date on Kubernetes now? You know everything you need to know?
I'm feeling a lot more confident in walking into a conversation on it now. It's been pretty good, actually, Scott. And, but definitely, as David mentioned, I appreciate your honest answers with it. It's definitely an area that I want to upskill myself in. As the years have progressed, Scott, you mentioned at the beginning there as to where your career goes. I mean, I'm around about the same age as yourself now, and definitely, I'm finding that my technical skills are becoming weaker, less and less, just because of my role now, my job, or what I do. But I still very much like to keep my hand in where I can, and which is why I've still got my home lab running here. And Kubernetes is definitely pretty high on my to educate myself list for 2018.
Yeah. Well, you know how to reach me, so when you start to get into it, you hit me up, and we'll get you all set.
Hey, I appreciate that. So, a question for you there, Scott. People listening to this, if they want to, read your blog, follow your tweets, anything else on social media, really, how do they go about doing that?
Yeah, sure. So Twitter and my blog are really the only places that I'm online. I don't do Facebook or anything like that. And on Twitter, I'm at Scott_Lowe. And then my website is blog.scottlowe.org. So it's the same URL that I've had for 13 years now. At some point, I should probably change it, but there are just way too many permalinks to have to worry about. So I'm not going to So I write about, a variety of topics. Obviously largely focused on Kubernetes and cloud native topics now. But you'll see me talk about, Linux and related junk as well, since I'm a, sort of full-blown Linux person now. So. Yeah,
definitely. Anyone listening to this, if you're not already following Scott on Twitter and, his blog posts as well. Actually, I've got a notification. So every time you do post a new post on your blog there, Scott, I get notified. So definitely add that to your bookmarks list.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that recommendation.
Yeah, one of my favorite posts on your blog is the technology short take series.
Yes.
I feel like I learned so much in just a single post about so many different things. So keep
that's been I've had quite a few readers mention that they really enjoy that. So I've had to slow down a little bit on those. Heptio keeps me really busy working with customers, which is great because that's where we need to be. But I do have another one actually scheduled to go out in just a couple of days. So.
And then before we go, can you tell us about the full stack journey?
Oh yeah, sure, of course. I didn't necessarily, I mentioned it just to kind of give some context, but I didn't necessarily, mention it to get a plug. But I started this a couple years ago. I think at the end of this year, it'll be 2 years. And I joined Packet Pushers, Greg Farrow and Ethan Banks and others a little while after that. And the idea behind the full stack journey was initially, I was thinking about this thing called the full stack engineer and could never really quite get my hands around what that looked like. And so we were talking about sort of people who had made the transition between two significant disciplines. Like they had gone from being a networking person to now working in programming or some other type of very significant technology shift, right? And then I started bringing on guests just to kind of help us talk about some of these new technologies that were coming into play, largely cloud native focused, things like service mesh and Kubernetes and those types of things. And so the more that I began thinking about this, the more the podcast has become more of like talking about sort of the full stack of technologies that you'll find in the modern data center. And that's sort of the tagline that I often use when I'm kicking the podcast off. And it's just talking with ordinary folks about either the journey that they've made in learning something new, or if they are, well-versed, I won't say expert because that has loaded meanings, but if they're well-versed in particular technology, then I'll get them on to talk about that particular technology, right? So I've had folks like Sebastian Guazgin with Bitnami come on and talk about Kubernetes. I've had George Miranda, I believe was his last name, come on and talk about Linkerd, which is the Cloud Native Computing Foundation official service mesh project, that kind of stuff, right? I had Shannon McFarland with Cisco come on and talk about Istio. So, we just kind of mix it up. It's a monthly podcast because honestly, I don't know. I don't know how often vChat gets published, but anything more than once a month for me is just like, wow, I don't have time for that. So yeah, monthly podcast. Right. So we do have another one coming out within the next week or 2 weeks, talking about sort of like the changes in the networking industry and what that means for networking professionals and where you can get started if you want to break into networking.
Nice.
Fantastic. Scott, so, listeners, how do they get hold of your podcast? Through the normal channels, such as iTunes, for example? Anywhere else?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. So you can get it through all the major channels like iTunes, Stitcher. I don't even know. Greg and Ethan are just like, they're machines with getting this thing published everywhere, right? So all those normal channels, and then obviously straight off the Packet Pushers website, there's a link for shows, and you can follow that link to go to Full Stack Journey. Datanauts is another really, really popular show with Chris Wall. And that's also part of the Packet Pushers network. So if you were interested in finding a Datanaut show, you could also get that off the Packet Pushers website.
Fantastic.
Awesome. Well, it's been an honor and pleasure to have you on today, Scott. Thanks so much.
Absolutely. Thank you, guys. And I've thoroughly enjoyed the conversation. It's great to catch up with both of you.
Yeah, and likewise, Scott. It's great to see you. It's been a while. So
Absolutely. Thank you.
great chat to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Scott. Bye-bye.